What if you could invest in a hard asset like silver and then earn a return in that same asset, bypassing the fiat dollar system entirely? Now you can. Monetary Metals has made a name for itself by generating a yield on gold and silver for their clients over the past 8 years and counting. Now they're offering the first silver bond in almost 200 years with a 12% annual interest rate paid in physical ounces of silver. Available to accredited investors only, investors in the bond receive a fixed 12% coupon on silver paid in physical ounces of silver, plus any silver price appreciation. Over half the bond has already been sold, and the remaining allocations are going fast. Do not miss being a part of this historic offering. Protect and grow your wealth in an asset that has stood the test of time. Secure your spot at realvision.com/metals.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this deep dive on macro and geopolitics here at Real Vision. My name is Andreas Steno, your host for the next hour, and I'm pleased to be joined by one of the best watchers of macro and geopolitics out there, namely Jacob Shapiro, head of geopolitics and macro at the Bespoke Group. Great to see you, Jacob.
I don't know if I'm one of the best, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, Andreas. Do you even have enough American context to understand that joke?
Oh, to be honest, no.
That's okay. The audience will get it.
Yeah, hopefully they will. Jacob, it's a massive backdrop in geopolitics that we're going to discuss today with everything ongoing in the Middle East. We have the election upcoming in the US. We have turbulence in Mexico in politics as well. So plenty of ground to cover here. But I'd like to start with the Middle East since it's basically the center of attention right now. We're currently still awaiting the response from Israel after the rocket attack from Iran on Israeli soil a few days back. So please fill us in on the status right now. How do you view the situation? Is it going to escalate from here? What's your take?
First of all, it's incredible that it's been a year since October 7th. That anniversary sort of crept up on me. So Israel has been at war for a year. And I won't say this is unprecedented, but this is not what the Israel Defense Forces has had its greatest success at. Usually it's short wars where they completely obliterate their enemies, and then they go back to being startup nation or running the economy or any of the things that Israel does. They've been at war for a year, and it looks like they're going to be at war for a lot longer. In terms of whether this escalates, that has been the question for literally a year, and it hasn't escalated. And it hasn't escalated even as Israel pushes more aggressively and harder against the enemies on its borders, whether that's Hamas in the Gaza Strip or Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're even striking targets in Syria, or even going directly against Iranian interests. They even managed to hit the Houthis in Yemen, which is something I didn't think they were really capable of doing myself. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that Iran and its access of resistance is fairly weak. It looked early on in the conflict like they had Israel by the horns, and now Israel has said, okay, if you want to play that way, let's take off the gloves. We're going to see what you actually have. And Iran and all of its little proxies are scurrying all over the place. We also have, in the last couple of months, Iran had a president who mysteriously died in a helicopter crash, is going through a domestic political transition of its own, and is isolated from the Sunni Arab states that are all around it. So you put all this together, ironically, Israel's in the driver's seat here. So all the escalation that we've seen so far has been because Israel wants there to be escalation. So the question here is, how far does Israel go? And I have to confess to you, I've been wrong about this for the last 8 to 9 months, because I thought there was going to be a really, really intense sort of 3-4 month period, and then Israel would have to dial it back. That's not what they're doing. They have basically obliterated the Gaza Strip. They have completely decapitated Hezbollah with all sorts of scary and new techniques and technologies that, for me, open up a can of worms in sort of general global politics. And then they're starting to hit it at Iran directly. So do I think that there's an escalatory scenario coming? I don't think it's World War III. I don't even think it's regional war. I really think the question is, how far is Israel going to go? And right now, it seems like they're going to go pretty far. It seems like they're not going to stop at least until they feel like they've decimated Hezbollah. And maybe they're going to try and go after Iran's nukes too. This wouldn't be the first time that they struck nuclear facilities of an enemy state in the Middle East. Maybe they feel like they have to do that as well.
So Jacob, I suppose that you saw this video from Benjamin Netanyahu on X. I think it was out a handful of days ago on where he basically addressed the Iranian people, telling them to stick with Israel in this fight against the Shia Muslim powers of the region. How did you sort of view the message from Benjamin Netanyahu? Was that sort of a sign that Israel could be tempted to go further than what you had envisioned just a few months ago?
Well, if I was the supreme leader, I would have thrown out my beeper and my pager and my walkie-talkie and my cell phone and my laptop after watching that video. It's. I think that Netanyahu is probably fronting there. I don't think that he really has anything to stand on. But he is right that Iran is a theocratic state. It's an authoritarian state. It has a large population that does not necessarily think that way, that does not think of Shiite fundamentalism or think that the Islamic Republic is the greatest thing that was ever invented in the history of the world. One of my favorite anecdotes about this was when Game of Thrones was really, really popular in its early seasons. Iranian students were having Game of Thrones filming or watching parties in the streets of Tehran near the universities, and the police had to come in and break them up. So there is a young and liberal-minded and open group, like section of the Iranian population that is probably not happy with the way things are going. The flip side of that is the Iranian government has the guns and has the power, and they have shown the ability to crack down on any and all dissent. So there's no number of pagers or walkie-talkies or even airstrikes that is going to get the Iranian people to go out and throw down their own government. And if Netanyahu's thinking that's what's going to happen, I don't know, maybe the Mossad has better intelligence than I do, but that to me seems to be hyperbole. That's going to be in the hands of Iran itself. Now, the thing that Israel can do, and by going after Iran the way that they have, they've done this a little bit, they can show how empty the promises of the Iranian regime are. They can discredit the Iranian regime to its own people. They can say all of this foreign adventurism, all this money that is being spent on the Houthis and on Hezbollah, what is that doing for the average Iranian person? Maybe that moves the dial a little bit, but ultimately I don't think the Iranian people are going to rise up because Benjamin Netanyahu gives some kind of speech.
You want to unfuck your shit? This is live.
Yeah, that's being recorded. Hey, listen, if you want to unfuck your future, then come and join us in the Real Vision community. Incredible platform, amazing content, some of the smartest people in the world, and amazing tools. And guess what? It'll cost you nothing. Come to realvision.com. I'll see you there, and let's help you unfuck your future.
So, Jacob, we've seen a response from oil markets over the past couple of weeks to this turmoil. And I guess the big question, now that we are 1 year into this conflict, is whether there is a path to a deal between Israel and, for example, Saudi Arabia, despite turbulence in Gaza and in Lebanon still. So how do you view the ongoing negotiations, if there are any, between Israel and Saudi Arabia surrounding a peace deal and potentially a deal that also includes added oil to oil markets?
Yeah, so it took us about 8 minutes to get to the political landmines in the conversation. So people have really strong opinions about Israel-Palestine. I'm going to piss all of them off with what I'm about to say. And I know that I'm doing my job right because I get it from both sides whenever I talk about this thing. The dirty little secret about the Middle East is that no one cares about the Palestinians. Not the Arab states, not the Palestinian leaders, not the European Union, not the United States, not the American left. They don't care. Period. Because the Palestinians have been betrayed and sold up the river by all of these people so many times over the past century that I can't even really count them. It's why I feel so bad for the Palestinians. No one is really sticking up for them. So your question was, is there some potential for a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia? There's already a deal. It doesn't have to be official on a piece of paper. So then they'll be able to write the newspaper articles about it. Then all the T's will be crossed and the I's will be dotted. But Israeli planes can fly over Saudi airspace. Israel is sharing intelligence probably with the Saudis right now. They have this shared enemy in Iran, and they're working together on that course. There's investments going back and forth, maybe not in Saudi Arabia, but in the Gulf. The Israelis are active in the Gulf, and the Gulf states are active in Israel. So is there going to be some kind of official deal? Probably not. Probably Saudi Arabia wants to hold out for some goodies from the United States. And maybe they think they're going to get more goodies from either a Harris administration or a Trump administration. So why waste time with the Biden administration to put their signatures on the piece of paper? But the piece of paper doesn't matter. The Saudis and the Arab states in general are working with Israel against Iran. The bigger question here, and I can't figure out why people aren't talking about this more, the looming threat here to Israel in all of this is not really Iran, and it's not even the Sunni Arab states, it's Turkey. Because Turkey is the big Sunni Arab power that is rising. It's a Mediterranean power. It has the most advanced military, it has one of the biggest militaries within NATO. Obviously, the United States takes first, and there's a couple other countries, but Turkey has a formidable military of its own. It's got troops on the ground in Syria. It's got troops on the ground in Iraq. It is thinking about a new neo-Ottoman sort of empire. And if you look at what Erdogan and Turkey has said around what's happening with the Palestinians, it has criticized Israel harshly. There was even a moment a couple months ago where Erdogan was talking about building up military strength. So in the future, Turkey could prevent Israel from doing these sorts of things to the Palestinians. So that's the sort of quiet elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. But the Saudi-Israel deal, for my intents and purposes, that's basically done. And nothing that's going to happen right now to the Palestinians is going to change the fundamentals. It may change the messaging. It may change the things on the surface, but they're working together. That's all we really need to know.
So, Jacob, speaking of Turkey, right? Returns in Turkey have actually been pretty decent since the invasion of Ukraine and through the 2022 sell-off in equity markets. We had pretty decent returns in Turkey as well. So how do you view Turkey as a macro case, given the turbulence in the Middle East, but also given the role they play in the Ukrainian-Russian relations here?
Yeah, I've been bullish Turkey for a couple of years now, and that has borne out pretty well. And some of that was luck. I mean, I was worried about the Turkish lira had been circling around the toilet bowl for quite some time, and Erdogan's, let's call them unorthodox monetary policies weren't helping very much. But as a result of that, and as a result of the foreign investors fleeing for the exits, you had the sort of normal Turkish investor thinking, well, what am I going to do with my money? Because Turkish fixed income is not going to work with the lira depreciating. The Turkish government cracked down on crypto. There was a surge of interest in Bitcoin and other crypto, but the Turkish government shut that off. So really, if you were an average everyday Turk, your only chance at preserving some of your wealth was going after Turkish equities. And the boom in Turkish equities that we've seen in recent years is in large part because the average Turkish citizen has been putting money into the Turkish market. And when Erdogan won his election and got done with the sort of populist goodies that he needed to hand out for his election and pivoted back to orthodox monetary policy, suddenly the foreign investors liked it too. So that's the sort of accidental part of this that went well. What's not accidental is that Turkey is really the only modern industrial economy in the Middle East, and it's stealing market share from Europe in terms of manufacturing. It has open relations with China and wants those open trade relations to continue. The Russia-Ukraine war, it really stayed on the sidelines. It's been supporting Ukraine in some senses, but it's kept diplomatic ties open with Russia. It still imports a lot of energy and food from Russia, but at the same time, they're investing in being self-sufficient in food. They've got lots of interesting offshore gas plays that they're dealing with. So you start stacking things on top of each other, and Turkey looks like a really, really good opportunity. It's a country that, over and over again, if you have powers that are based around what is today Istanbul, what used to be Constantinople, those are usually extremely wealthy, extremely powerful trading nations that impact how the world is going. And I think Turkey is in the very beginning stages of growing back into that power.
So, Jacob, this turbulence in the Middle East, a rising oil price, soon to be seen at the pump as well in the US. How will it impact the US election? I guess that's the big question now. Is this current turbulence an issue for Kamala's ticket?
I don't think it is. I mean, oil prices have been relatively subdued, not just on this, but we had disruptions in Libya. I think there's more than enough oil out there to meet demand. The Saudis are telling you that, like the way that everybody is behaving is telling you that oil probably has further to go down, which was a surprise to me at the start of the year, but the data is fairly unambiguous here. So I'm not expecting any huge increase when it comes to that. If we're talking about domestic sort of energy issues or things like that might affect Kamala, and maybe we'll get to this in a little bit. I mean, we've got a hurricane that is barreling down on Florida. We've got the fallout from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. Like those are things that I think might affect sort of the economic ticket more. We also had the port strike, which it seems there's a temporary reprieve there. They're going to push it to January. That might have really impacted the election and how things were going to go. But I just don't really see it. And I also don't think that it's going to affect Kamala in terms of the support of the left. Because even though there are some passionate wings on the left in the United States that are pro-Palestinian and don't like what the U.S. government is doing in its support of Israel, they're going to vote for Trump, the guy who moved the embassy to Jerusalem, who like was the architect of the Abraham Accords, who is much more hawkish and has a tight relationship with Netanyahu. Like, there's not another option here. So you can either sit out or you can say, okay, Kamala is going to be a little bit better than for Trump. So I just don't see, barring some huge Israeli escalation, which is, it's hard to imagine that there's going to be some huge back and forth that actually affects the U.S. election. I don't see how the Middle East drama is going to affect either Kamala's chances or Trump's chances. I don't think that's what Americans are voting on.
Speaking of this election, Jacob, I had this question from a client of mine earlier today, and I actually think it's a tricky question to answer right now. Do you think the market has got a base case for that election already priced in, or is it a 50-50 play?
I mean, if Mr. Market is smarter than all of us, hats off to Mr. Market, but I don't know how you can have a base case right now. This election is super tight. All of the polling data, well, first thing, when you're thinking about polling data is backward looking. So it's only giving a snapshot of weeks ago. We don't have that much data with Kamala because remember, she came to the race relatively late. And polls are all over the place. Some are saying that Harris is leading across the board. Some are saying it's much tighter in the swing states. You hear people with private polling saying, actually, Trump is looking like the odds-on favorite here. So hats off to anybody who feels like they have a base case here. But at least for me and what I've been advising with my clients is, keep powder dry because I don't know exactly which direction this is going to go in. And if the polls are anything close to right, it's going to be very, very close. That's the only thing I feel relatively comfortable saying. And even that might not be true. Maybe we'll see a landslide in the swing states for Kamala based on all the crazy things that Trump has done over the past couple of months. So, yeah, I don't see the base case. So it's hard for me to believe that anybody else out there has the base case.
So, Jake, one of the things that I've discussed with other pundits on Real Vision, but also with clients of mine over the past couple of months of relatively weak labor market data in the US is whether this phenomenon of hesitancy in terms of hiring patterns is related to the upcoming election. And seen from Europe, and I'd like your take on this as well, it seems like the outcome space is wider than ever, basically, ahead of this election. You have two candidates with an extreme distance between them. So, assuming you were a business leader and had to take a decision on hiring people right now, would you await this election? And could this be the explanation why we've seen so weak labor markets?
Yeah, so two things I've been telling my clients, and I've been speaking at various conferences and saying, first of all, I'm not sure that there's that much difference. If you prepare for a protectionist, deglobalizing, demagogic ideologue, no matter who wins, you're going to be prepared. There is no free trade candidate here. There's no the one difference is that Kamala Harris will be much friendlier to U.S. allies and partners. So maybe you won't have U.S.-Europe trade friction. The U.S.-Mexico relationship will be better. But generally speaking, we're talking about degrees. We're not talking about major changes in policy. So I actually don't think that there's that big of a difference in terms of preparation. The other thing, and this gets back to your question about the labor market, when I'm talking about the United States right now, I don't put up election polls and I don't put up labor market data. The first chart that I put up is what do U.S. demographics look like? What does the change in the rate of population growth in the United States? And it's lower, it's close to zero, it's lower than it's ever been in the last 100 years. So that accounts for World War I, it accounts for World War II. And I think the labor data, it's not showing us some of the things that are actually happening in the real economy. Because yes, maybe there's some soft hiring around the edges here, but if you are, a laborer, if you're in construction, if you're in agriculture and you're trying to find someone to go out in the field and pick apples or whatever, or whatever you're harvesting, that labor is incredibly expensive and it's only going up. And it's going up because the population is going down, because you've got all these bottlenecks around immigration. Immigration has become a political firestorm between the two candidates, and nobody really has a good answer. And if we're really, really thinking macro, I think the lower levels of the U.S. economy, the ones where people are not reporting how much they're getting paid to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that labor is getting more scarce and it's getting more expensive. And I think that's affecting things up and down the chain. So no, I wouldn't read anything about the election into the labor data and people waiting around to see what's going to happen. I think this is a broad structural thing that's been happening since COVID, since immigration completely went nuts, and the United States has just not metabolized that problem yet. And I think we're seeing some of that now going further up the chain.
we've obviously seen a similar syndrome in Europe and in China. So fading demographics. The outlook looks even weaker if you look at the southern parts of Europe and China on demographics. So where does this demographic issue leave the outlook for the US, also in terms of macro and investments?
This is one of the ways I differ from other geopolitical or macro strategists that you'll normally talk to. They like to say, they'll use demographics like a crystal ball, and just like political polling, demographics is a backward-looking figure. So I'm not saying ignore it, but things can change very quickly. A good example of what I mean: Poland had arguably the worst demographics in the European Union up until Russia invaded Ukraine. And now there has been a surge of immigration into Poland of young Ukrainian women and children. And suddenly, Poland has some of the best demographics in the entire European Union. So things can change very quickly. The United States and China, I'm less worried about. The United States, because the United States is not short on people who want to come to the country. It just doesn't have the legal mechanisms and the law enforcement mechanisms to let them in. But if they ever stopped squabbling in Washington, the problem is not that they have to attract the people. The problem is getting them in and integrating them. That's the source of American power going back centuries. That's what the United States is supposed to be good at. China obviously doesn't have immigrants trying to break the door down. What China has is hundreds of millions of people living in the interior of the country who Xi Jinping and the Communist Party want to redistribute wealth to. So you're not going to get a sudden burst in total fertility rate in China, although, you saw how they went with the one-child policy. If they come out with a three-child policy, okay, it'll take 10, 15 years, but these things can change incredibly quickly. It's why I don't use demographics like a crystal ball for predictive reasons. But the point about China is they have hundreds of millions of people within the interior of the country. If you could integrate them into the Chinese economy more fully, okay, like that's a shot in your arm while you wait for the total fertility rate to normalize, and maybe while you push policies that are going to allow people to have more children. The situation for Europe at large, or for Russia, for example, is a little more grim, because it's not clear to me, what are the unorthodox ways of dealing with the demographic problem. Japan is also in this camp, although Japan is allowing for more immigration from places like Indonesia. It's also ahead when it comes to things like robotics and AI and using those things in the context of their economy. So those are harder cases. And it doesn't mean that it's impossible. There are certainly tons of immigrants who would like to come to Europe. It's just generally harder for the Europeans to integrate immigrants into their population. Japan, like I said, is trying to attract immigrants, is setting up, more attractive terms for foreign visitors and foreign investors and foreign entrepreneurs or tech nomads to come and work there. So you start looking around and you start piecing in also, what is robotics? What is AI going to help us do in this context? I'm less worried about shrinking demographics in that sense, but different countries have different strengths and are going to have to deal with different problems in order to sort through it.
Speaking of China, we've been through a couple of eventful weeks out there, especially in financial markets in China. We've seen one of the largest rallies I can remember, especially during such a short time span. And on the first day of the announcement of this stimulus package, I wrote an article called "Bringing Chopsticks to a Gunfight" again from China. And currently I look like Comical Ali when I refer to that. But Jacob, overall, are they doing too little too late? Fill us in a little bit on this Chinese stimulus plan.
Well, I mean, we're recording here on October 8th, and the Hang Seng was down almost 10%. So I'm not sure that you look as foolish as you think that you look. Look, I'll say that for our clients, for the last couple of months, we've been quietly buying beat up Chinese names because we thought the valuations were super low, and we think there are really interesting opportunities in China, especially when you get into the renewable energy space, into the tech space. There's a lot of competition in China, so you have to do your due diligence and figure out, well, which ones are really going to be the ones that hang around. Because ironically, I think I stole this point from Louis Gave, but in some sense, it's tougher to be a Chinese startup than it is to be in the United States or some of these other companies that can rely on government support. So let's take a step back here for a second. Longer term, I've been a China bull, and we'll see if that bears out. There's plenty of reasons to take the opposite point of view, but generally speaking, I think China will muddle its way through and find a way to get there. This is not a country I want to bet against. Most geopolitical analysts, if you're just looking at the facts, going back to 1950, probably would have said that everything China's accomplished since then under communist rule was impossible. This is not a country that I particularly want to bet against when we're talking about the long term. Ironically, though, in the short term, I have to agree with you. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I had Marco Papich on my podcast just last week, and we actually debated this, and he was incredibly bullish. And he was incredibly bullish because he thought what happened last week, yes, maybe they were bringing chopsticks to a gunfight, but he said this was a sea change in policy and that a lot more was going to be coming and that sentiment was going to change based on that. And I took the opposite view on that because, like you, I'd like to see the guns come out before I say that something is going to change. And if you read sort of Pekingology is a great Substack out there that translates a lot of things that are happening in China that most English speakers and Western observers can't get to. When you were there was a conference shortly after all of the big announcements where a lot of economists and professors were saying, okay, this is a great first step, but what's going to happen? Like, we have promises of X, but like, what is it actually going to be? And when is it going to be instituted? And what is it going to look like? So we don't actually have specifics. The second thing here is that the huge run up in Chinese equities, I think that's mostly foreign investors. I don't think that has anything to do with the Chinese citizen, him or herself. And I'll go back to the Turkey example here. One of the things that would be great for China, and which I think Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are trying to do, they're trying to effect this massive cultural shift where instead of Chinese people either hiding their money under their mattress or buying a third and fourth condo to protect their money from the government, they want the Chinese people to invest or to consume or to spend. And buying Chinese equities would be a great way to do that. So until I see either real Chinese stimulus, like the type that shows real fundamental changes are underway, or until I see Chinese citizens driving up the price of Chinese equities, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical and I'm going to want to be bargain hunting at the bottom here rather than saying, okay, something has absolutely changed here and we are off to the races for the next 6 to 12 months. So that's where I'm at. I agree with you that it's chopsticks to a gunfight. I think there are plausible scenarios out there where maybe there's more coming and maybe our skepticism will mean we will miss out on sort of a big run, but I don't have the stomach for it quite yet. And in the meantime, I think quietly, at the bottom, there are a lot of interesting Chinese companies, whether it's in batteries, whether it's in semiconductors, whether it's in solar. Like, those are companies that I think are very interesting and that other companies outside of China are going to have a very hard time competing with the Chinese champions that eventually emerge in the long run.
Speaking of these companies within green tech and renewables and stuff like that, Jacob, we've had new tariffs incoming both in the European Union and in the US on, for example, EVs, but also other products exported from China. So in this stimulus package, we haven't really seen a clear message to the European Union and the US related to those tariffs. So how do you think the Chinese authorities will deal with that? Will they try to subsidize their way out of this, or do they feel like they have the competition power to actually make their way through?
They're too competitive. I mean, they're completely oversupplied. Have you seen these pictures in China of EVs now being parked in the ghost cities because there's not enough people to buy them? I mean, the scale and the scope of change here is absolutely incredible from what China has done. And obviously, it would be nice if a release valve for them would be to export some of these things abroad. I think, European companies or US automakers, I think they're fighting a losing battle here. I don't think you're going to be able to compete with China when it comes to EVs, and I'm not even sure that you want to. I'm not convinced that the electric vehicle, as it's currently built, is what's going to be around in the future. You've traded dependence on oil for dependence on cobalt and lithium and copper and a whole bunch of mineral commodities that it's not clear to me we actually have enough supply of for the global demand that would come if EVs were taking up. I think that's why if you look closer at the data, people are more interested in hybrids. If you look at, Toyota's been saying now we're interested in hydrogen and in fielding hydrogen vehicles. You look at what the shipping industry is doing and going towards ammonia. Like, I don't think there's a real answer here yet. So I think China went hard and fast at the first thing. And all of these other sort of tariffs that are at them, it's about catching up. And I don't think they're going to catch up. I think China, for better and for worse, is going to be at the front of this. And the rest is just sort of window dressing.
So, in all honesty, Jacob, I got caught a little bit long in Indian equities when this rally started in China. And at least when you look at the statistics, it's rarely a good idea to be very long India when China is rallying. So speak to this point a little bit. Where does this leave India if China is actually coming out firing on all cylinders? Is there a competition between India and China that we're not aware of in the West here?
India is a great example. Like what's happening in Indian equities right now is exactly what I think Xi Jinping wants to happen in Chinese equities. Because one of the things, and I've been sort of bearish Indian equities the last couple of years, and I've embarrassingly had my face ripped off a couple of times because of it. Because I've said, oh, this is the top is in it. And it's not the top because Indians have gone crazy for equities. They are adding tens, if not hundreds of millions of people who are trying to buy shares of Indian stocks because I think we're at the very beginning of the mania for equities inside of India itself. So again, I think we have to get away from everything that we thought before in the globalized world and the relationships between emerging markets and developed markets in that world. The world has changed. And the things that I've been talking about for years, like deglobalization and nearshoring, multipolarity, these were all theoretical concepts and they were largely predictions. They're not theoretical anymore. They're real. So I think if you're looking at India, I'm still afraid of investing in India just sort of top down generally, because I think there are going to be pockets of the Indian economy that are going to do really well, and there are going to be pockets of the Indian economy that are not going to do particularly well. So I would say, like, you want to focus on those areas where India does have some kind of strategic advantage, rather than betting on the country as a whole. And again, I would say the same thing about China. Like, I didn't say just long term, I'm bullish everything in the Chinese economy. I said no, there are these very specific sectors and these very specific companies that I think you could have real success with. I think the same is true in India. The other thing about India, I mean, my business partner Rob always says that quantity has a quality all of its own. So when we're talking about India, when Narendra Modi first was elected, one of his big promises was, by the time that I leave office, there will be indoor plumbing in every single Indian house. That's the level of development we're talking here. So while everybody's talking about the commanding heights of tech and podcasts being made by AI and all these other different things, like India's still at the level of, can we get toilets and air conditioning in every single house? Like, how much would that actually drive up Indian growth? Let's get infrastructure. Let's get cold storage infrastructure so food can get from point A to point B in India without spoiling. How much would that add in terms of overall GDP or efficiency ratings and things like that? So I would not take the bait there, and I would say those relationships between emerging markets that were true before, I'm not sure that they necessarily hold right now. And I would be interested in attacking the parts of the Indian economy that are going to do well in this world that is more competitive and where nearshoring and things like that are operative.
Jacob, speaking of trade partners of the US, we obviously have a big trade partner just south of the border in Mexico as well. And I know you follow the LATAM case closely as well. We've seen a lot of investors piling into Mexico through 23, especially. The Mexican peso was a tremendous carry trade. And then all of a sudden we had the election and the old president AMLO was replaced by Claudia Sheinbaum. It seems like the case kind of turned during that election, and we had some constitutional issues right after the election. For those not in the know around what's ongoing in Mexican politics, can you fill us in a little bit on what has changed here with the change of leadership?
Well, it's really more what hasn't changed. So let's try to do this very succinctly. So I'll be painting with a broad brush here. So any Mexican experts, like, don't worry. Like, I know that I'm painting with a broad brush. Mexico is basically a single-party authoritarian dictatorship from roughly the 1920s until the end of the 1990s. And then around the end of the 1990s, Mexico pivots in a real way towards democracy, and that's part of NAFTA and free trade. That's part and parcel of that. And you get roughly 20 years of what I would call real democracy inside of Mexico. And during that time, Mexico's wealth expands enormously, but as often happens with free trade and globalization in that first phase of growth, so does inequality. So even though Mexico on the whole, the macro data shows that it's much richer, the gulf between the haves and the have-nots has gotten richer. And then at the same time, you've got the cartels, this facing off against the Mexican government and goaded on by the United States, which wants to sell weapons and wants to stem the flow of drugs and illicit money into the United States, pushes the Mexican government to do battle with the cartels. And that creates a violent situation that scares a lot of people away from Mexico in general. In that context, the outgoing president, I guess he's already gone, the outgone president, President AMLO, finally wins an election outright. He had gotten close a couple of times previously. It's sort of like a Bernie Sanders type figure. He's crazy. He says wacky things, but people trust him. They think he's not corrupt. They think the cartels can't talk to him. They think that the system doesn't have him. And I think they were largely right about that. And that was why AMLO came to power with such a large majority and had sky-high approval ratings inside of Mexico, northwards of 60%. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, they would kill for the types of approval ratings that AMLO has at the end of his presidency, let alone at the beginning of their presidencies. Now, Sheinbaum is his hand-picked successor. And the only thing that has meaningfully changed is that for the last 3 years, AMLO did not have a supermajority in Mexico's legislature, in its upper and lower houses. And that matters because Mexico is not sort of the type of place where you pass a law and something changes. If you want to change something in Mexico, you really have to change the Constitution. That's where real change happens. And unless you have a supermajority, you're probably not going to change the Constitution. Now, at least on paper, Sheinbaum with Morena, it's just on the edge of the supermajority. But in this judicial reform case that just went through, she was able to peel off a couple people who were not technically in her party who voted in favor of the judicial reforms that she was for and which AMLO was for too. So that tells us, oh, maybe she does have the supermajority. Maybe she can push through some of these populist reforms. And I think there's a couple reasons to be scared here, and then we could talk about why I'm not scared at all, why I'm actually incredibly optimistic. But if you're a bear and you want the bear case, you're saying, okay, here is a populist leader who has super majorities in the Mexican legislature, so she can do whatever really she wants to do, who has talked about doing things that would ensconce Morena as a sort of single party dictatorship. So going back to what Mexico was like for most of the 20th century, rolling back some of the democratic reforms that were there, making sure that Morena can put people in positions of power that would keep Morena politicians going forward. Talking about a Mexican government that is going to be more extractive when it comes to things like mining or like agriculture, using things like land reform and redistribution of wealth, putting the Mexican state in the economy much more so than it has been previously. You put all those things together, yeah, there are definitely some things to be scared of. But as I've been saying, if you are a wealthy Mexican family, or if you are a Mexican business or a foreign investor who is tied to things like agriculture, real estate, mining, energy, yeah, you have a lot to worry about here. But separate from that, like the Mexican economy is going to do great. The geopolitical fundamentals here don't care whether it's Sheinbaum or AMLO or some corrupt guy who's in bed with the cartels. Mexico has more geopolitical tailwinds than it's had since Santa Anna. I'm not one that's sort of bent for hyperbole, but like I really do think that. And I think that the geopolitical fundamentals for Mexico at the broad macro level are going to help Mexico rather than hurt Mexico. So there are sectors that I would be afraid of, and there are certain types of families and clients that should be afraid. But overall, if we're just talking about the trajectory of Mexican politics, they're at the center of nearshoring. They've got a young population. Maybe all of this political corruption and things like that, maybe that's also going to bring more people into real jobs. I feel like it's every other day a company is talking about what factory they're building in Mexico or moving operations there. I believe it was NVIDIA this morning that just talked up a huge manufacturing facility that they're going to put up there. So, I mean, I like all of that macro stuff, and I think that it outweighs a lot of the noise that we've heard about Sheinbaum herself. The last thing I'll say here, because I know I've gone on, is that Sheinbaum, more than any other political figure in the world, reminds me of Angela Merkel. And whether you like Angela Merkel or not, she did incredible things for the German economy. And the reason I make that comparison is because Sheinbaum, unlike AMLO, who was sort of this weird populist guy who did a lot of things, she's a scientist. She has a PhD in environmental engineering. Raise your hand if you've read any of her papers, listeners. Have any of you taken the time to read any of her academic papers? There's 40 or 50 of them available online. If you're having trouble sleeping, go ahead and download a few. I've read 2 or 3 of them myself. This is a policy wonk. This is a scientist. This is somebody who has real goals in terms of the environment and in making Mexico stronger. She strikes me more like Angela Merkel, somebody who is definitely politically savvy and who has been underestimated her entire career, but who is also extremely ruthless, extremely pragmatic, and extremely logical. Now, she may set up a system so that whoever follows her isn't great and can use all of these horrible authoritarian tendencies to do horrible things. But herself, I think this is the sweet spot. And I think that she's probably going to do good things for Mexico. But even if I'm wrong about that, and I admit that that is somewhat theoretical, just look at the fundamentals. Look at what nearshoring and deglobalization and multipolarity and Mexico's demographics mean for that economy. That stuff is all real, no matter what's true of the politics.
So, Jacob, the final question on this Mexican case is whether these fundamentals are at risk with the U.S. election. I mean, should we get Trump back in office, would you reconsider the fundamentals of the Mexican economy given that?
I would not reconsider them, but I would be the first to tell you that if Trump wins, in some ways, the biggest impact of that on a geopolitical level, I think will be the relationship between the United States and Mexico. Now, plenty of analysts, myself included, thought that the first time he was elected. What was interesting was AMLO and Trump liked each other. I don't know if you remember this. One of AMLO's first trips abroad, he went to Trump in Washington and gave him a little amulet that was supposed to protect him from disease. Like I said, these are weird guys, but they had a very, very good relationship. They were able to talk to each other. They felt like they were cut from the same cloth. It's another reason I like the Angela Merkel comparison. Do you remember what Trump and Merkel was like? Because personalities matter a lot when it comes to Trump. And I'm not convinced that the Sheinbaum Trump personality is going to work. Now, all of that said, no matter how much Sheinbaum wants Mexico to be more independent and not so reliant on the United States in terms of its economy, something like 70 to 80% of Mexican trade is dependent on the United States. So she is going to have to bend in all sorts of ways that she probably doesn't want to, whether it's Trump or whether it's Harris. I also have to believe that some of the things that Trump is saying, like he would deploy the U.S. military to Mexican territory to fight cartels with or without Mexico's permission, which is on his campaign website, which he's talked about. I have to believe that that is a threat, that is something that he's going to use in the context of another USMCA renegotiation or some sort of security deal with Mexico in general. If he's actually going to do all that, yeah, then bets are off and this could get really crazy really fast. But like I said, I think that's a really far out scenario. And one of the things we saw with Trump in the first go round was he will say crazy things because he's trying to get something that he wants. And in the case of Mexico, he wanted a renegotiation of NAFTA, which was the USMCA, which is going to get renegotiated again, I believe, in 2026. And honestly, the United States didn't get a lot out of it that it wanted. So I would expect that Trump is going to put a lot of pressure on Mexico with the goal towards getting more favorable outcomes in that next renegotiation. Again, none of that will impact, I think, the long-term geopolitical fundamentals for Mexico. The last thing here is that and this is one place where Marco's point earlier that I'll bring back, his bullishness about China. One of the reasons Marco was so bullish about China was because he thought that Trump is doing exactly what I just said in terms of posturing with China, that maybe Trump might actually want to have some kind of trade deal with China in the long run. And his hawkishness on Chinese trade is what would allow him to get there. That in some ways is the worst case scenario for Mexico, because the leverage that Mexico has over the United States right now is the United States cannot fight a major trade war with China and also fight one with Mexico. Mexico is the United States' ace in the hole. It's where the spare labor is. It's where the spare supply is. It's where you can really nearshore. It's, all these sort of fundamentals that I talked about, they become operative because the United States wants to get out of China. If Xi Jinping and Donald Trump 2.0 have a nicer piece of chocolate cake in Mar-a-Lago and hold hands and the Chinese start building EV factories in Detroit, okay, then there are problems for Mexico. And then the United States is going to deal with Mexico much differently. That's not my base case. And I find it very hard to imagine. But hey, somebody as smart as Marco is out there thinking that that is a possibility. And so if you got a real improvement in U.S.-China ties, that honestly would be more threatening to the fundamentals I'm talking about with Mexico than Claudia Sheinbaum or any of the Morena politicians that you're going to be reading about in the next couple of years.
Yeah. That is indeed a very interesting contrarian take, and one that I honestly hadn't thought about before you bringing it up here, Jacob. Thanks for mentioning that. Jacob Shapiro, always a true pleasure to host a guided tour around the geopolitical themes of the world with you. I'm always impressed by your knowledge and your thoughts around the geopolitical macro themes of various regions around the globe. Jacob Shapiro of Bespoke Investments, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Andreas.
My name is Andreas Steno, and I'll see you soon again on Platform.
What if you could invest in a hard asset like silver and then earn a return in that same asset, bypassing the fiat dollar system entirely? Now you can. Monetary Metals has made a name for itself by generating a yield on gold and silver for their clients over the past 8 years and counting. Now they're offering the first silver bond in almost 200 years with a 12% annual interest rate paid in physical ounces of silver. Available to accredited investors only, investors in the bond receive a fixed 12% coupon on silver paid in physical ounces of silver, plus any silver price appreciation. Over half the bond has already been sold, and the remaining allocations are going fast. Do not miss being a part of this historic offering. Protect and grow your wealth in an asset that has stood the test of time. Secure your spot at realvision.com/metals.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.